Welcome, everyone. We're very happy you managed to connect to us tonight. I am Anicia Morel. I cover global affairs at the French Embassy, and we are live from the French Institut in London. As you can see, it's a remarkable setting, an Art Deco library with stained glass and a beautiful collection of books and media resources. Our participants tonight are connecting from Devon, from London, Paris, and also Northumbria, so we hope for a good connection throughout. If you have any technical difficulty during the event, please flag it in the chat and we'll do our best to help you. And I now give the floor to the French ambassador to the United Kingdom, Catherine Colonna.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this special event organized by the French Embassy in the United Kingdom et par l'Institut français du Royaume-Uni. We're live from the Institut français online, and as a preview for tomorrow's Climate Action Summit that will bring together all the parties to the Paris Agreement 5 years after it was signed. We are extremely proud and honored by the participation of His Royal Highness the Prince of Wales, who has kindly agreed to speak to us tonight. Then a short awareness video will follow his message, and well, those of you familiar with football will recognize a quite familiar French figure here in the UK, our world champion Olivier Giroud. The conversation this evening will gather a prestigious panel. We are very grateful to President Fabius, who led COP21 negotiations, for being with us, along with Anne-Marie Trevelyan, UK champion for adaptation and resilience for the COP26 presidency, Alain Job, CEO of a global business, very global, you will see, and Professor Camille Parmesan, who has done very interesting research on the impact of climate change. That conversation will be moderated by Fiona Harvey. Thank you so much, Fiona, for taking this role and for being with us here at the Institut Français. Closing remarks will be given by my colleague and friend, João de Almeida, head of the EU delegation in the UK. A quick reminder before I give the floor to our guests. Next year will be a decisive year for climate action. France will host the One Planet Summit and the UICN World Congress on Biodiversity. COP15 on biodiversity will follow in Kunming, and COP26 in Glasgow in November. Here we are. All participants will be looking on how countries can join their efforts to help building a better and more resilient world. The time is right to do so when both the UK and the EU 27 have set new and ambitious goals of reduction of emissions. Time is for action. We must move forward, and I'd like to quote Jacinda Ardern, the Prime Minister of New Zealand, and a remarkable woman, should I say, a remarkable leader, who said last week, "It is about our global responsibilities. Collective action is required. If any nation falls short, we all fall short. I encourage everyone to be on the right side of history. Be part of the solution we must collectively deliver for the next generation." I wish you a very good evening, and now let's listen to the message of His Royal Highness, the Prince of Wales.
Mesdames et Messieurs, à la veille du sommet sur l'ambition climatique co-organisé par les Nations Unies, la France et le Royaume-Uni, j'ai été profondément touché d'avoir été sollicité par son Excellence l'ambassadrice de France pour proposer quelques réflexions à l'occasion du 5e anniversaire de l'accord de Paris sur le climat. J'ai été très fier il y a 5 ans de prendre la parole à l'ouverture de la COP21 à Paris et de voir l'accord historique qui s'en est suivi. 5 ans plus tard, nous nous trouvons à nouveau à un moment critique pour notre planète, avec une nouvelle occasion de déterminer l'avenir que nous léguerons aux générations suivantes. The current pandemic has brought unimaginable devastation to people's lives, their livelihoods and national economies. At the same time, the green recovery represents an unprecedented opportunity to rethink and reset the ways in which we live and do business, particularly as we look at tackling the interdependent climate, biodiversity, and health crises. Rather alarmingly, I realize that it is now more than 50 years since I first gave a speech encouraging the protection of our environment. In the decades since, I have seen for myself the changing land and seascapes, along with the devastating impact on lives and livelihoods in almost every corner of the globe. Over these many years, I have discussed the situation with leaders from every continent. I have also been fortunate to know many of the world's most eminent experts on these issues and have worked across the private and public sectors, as well as with NGOs and philanthropists, to identify practical solutions to the challenges that we face. Over this time, we have seen a few phases in terms of global mobilization. The first, kick-started in Rio in 1992, was to make the case for confronting climate change, knowing that no one country can tackle the climate, environment, and biodiversity crises alone. The second was to acknowledge that we must all work together on a common roadmap if we are to achieve results. This was achieved with the historic Paris Climate Agreement in 2015. The third, over these past 5 years, has been to reflect on what each of us must do to deliver on the targets we have set. Now, as we look to the next phase, it is time to implement. À cette fin, au cours de l'année dernière, j'ai travaillé dans le cadre de mon initiative des marchés durables avec des dirigeants mondiaux, des chefs d'industrie, des investisseurs et des experts pour identifier les solutions qui permettront d'accélérer nos progrès. La croissance économique de notre époque repose sur la construction d'un avenir durable. Mais pour y parvenir, nous devons réaliser que nous sommes un peuple partageant une même planète et non les pièces individuelles d'un puzzle. Il est également essentiel que nous remettions la nature au cœur de notre modèle économique, tout en rassemblant les ressources et l'énergie des secteurs publics, privés et philanthropiques, le tout à un rythme et à une échelle sans précédent. Having worked towards a Marshall-like plan for nature, people and planet, and as we look to 2021 and embark on a warlike footing, I look forward to continuing to work with coalitions of the willing who have the determination to shift our trajectory in line with a sustainable future. This is hard work, and as I know only too well, it will require relentless perseverance over the coming decade. I firmly believe we can succeed, and I intend, through my Sustainable Markets Initiative, to support the world in these efforts every step of the way. After all, human history has been shaped by the audacity to achieve that which had once seemed unachievable, to reach places which had seemed beyond our grasp, and to realize that which hitherto had lain beyond the bounds of our imagination. With this same audacious determination, we can bring about change at a pace and scale never seen before. And in so doing, we can secure the future of our planet and so much of the precious and diverse life that shares it. Mesdames et messieurs, il y a 5 ans, à Paris, j'ai dit qu'il n'y avait pas de plan B. Si nous n'agissons pas maintenant, le plan A ne sera plus réalisable. L'ambition est essentielle, mais l'ambition seule ne suffit pas. Pour ce 5e anniversaire, renouvelons nos efforts, visons toujours plus haut et agissons avec détermination. Non pas parce que nous le pouvons, mais parce que nous le devons.
Thank you to His Royal Highness for taking the time to support this event. And thank you for reaffirming the importance of the Paris Agreement. It has never been in doubt, but this reaffirming of our bilateral and international cooperation is extremely welcome, especially today. This is more than about governments. It is about people around the world, people who are directly affected by pollution and climate change. So I'm very proud to introduce masked books, or masked portraits, if you will. Masked books actually started 6 years ago, before COP21 and long before COVID. They're a symbol of the harm climate change does to our health, of the link between climate and health. So we've been very proud in London to work with a British artist, Lucy Orta, who immediately accepted to create a mask for Olivier Giroud. So Giroud, as you all know, is our World Cup champion, and he's now very happily settled in London, like so many of us, playing rather successfully for Chelsea. And he was immediately on board, accepted to pose for a portrait on a drizzly morning, the day after he had scored against Rennes, and a few days after he welcomed his fourth child. So we were very impressed by his kindness and patience. So what you are about to see is a new masked book, a new collection, which was commissioned especially for this anniversary. Now it is with great pleasure that I introduce Fiona Harvey from The Guardian. She is a great environmental journalist and she has kindly agreed to chair our panel on what we're hoping for from the Glasgow talks next year. There will be a live Q&A for which we ask you to use the Q&A box, not the chat, and do send your questions straight away. The Q&A will be at the end of the session, but start, sending questions now. Short and crisp is better. And also, if the questions are directed at one of the speakers, do mention the speaker. Fiona, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you for that kind introduction. And thank you all for taking part and for holding this wonderful event, because it is now 5 years since that historic day in Paris when the agreement was finally adopted. And of course that day came after 2 weeks of intense talks. Those 2 weeks of intense talks had followed 2 years in which the French government had put all of the diplomatic means at its disposal to bring countries together into this room for those talks. And those 2 years followed 25 years of international negotiations on the climate. 25 years which had been characterized by some notable successes, some terrible failures, but no agreement had ever been reached quite like the Paris Agreement. And what the Paris Agreement did was bring all of the countries of the world together for the first time to agree to limit global warming to no more than 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels, with an aspiration to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. And that had never been agreed before in that form. So it was historic. And tonight we're going to discuss not just the Paris Agreement itself, what's happened since then in the last 5 years, and how we go forward from here to next year's COP26 meeting, which will see the Paris Agreement fully implemented, we hope, with countries coming forward with their actual plans over the next decade and beyond for how we're going to fulfill the goals of Paris. So I'd like to begin by talking to Laurent Fabius, who is President of the Constitutional Council, but of course was Foreign Minister for France and COP21 President, who actually brought down the gavel on the Paris Agreement on that historic day 5 years ago. And I'd like to ask you, President Fabius, how did that feel?
Well, first, I'm very pleased to be with you, and I say hello to everybody. When you say, how did you feel? I mean, at the moment when I was striking with the gavel, well, first I was very deeply moved, and everybody has been able to see that. But what was maybe more interesting is that the audience, the ministers, everybody was really moved. And they were not accustomed to be moved because they were ministers, they were negotiators, and suddenly they were kissing each other. What does it mean? It means exactly what you said, that they have worked, we have worked during years and years, and we were hoping that it could be possible, but in fact, we didn't get it. I remember that 2 years ago when France has been chosen to host COP21, well, it was easy because we were the only candidate. But you know, if we were the only candidate, it was because there were not an enormous appetite to welcome the COP. And I remember that at that time, when people said, congratulations, félicitations, everybody said to me, good luck, Mr. Fabius. And I saw in their eyes hope and a slight element of doubt. Therefore, we have done it, and why? Obviously, the diplomatic service has been brilliant, and I pay tribute to to our diplomatic service. But in fact, more deeply, we were able to get together 3 planets. And it is true today, but things have changed in between. The first planet was the scientific planet. They have done a tremendous job. And it was because of them that most people at that time and now understand that there is a real climate change problem and that it is due to human action. There are still some people and even some personalities who believe the contrary, but fortunately, they are not really significant. But science, technology, they were tremendous. And from 2015, there has been an improvement since. Therefore, excellent, first planet. Second one, I would say civil society planet. Towns, regions, companies, associations, NGOs, they were with us and they were supporting us. But I must say that since 2015, we had with them what I would call a good surprise, honestly, and especially in the domain of companies. It doesn't mean that every company has understood that they have to change, but many of them have understood and they are doing an excellent job. And they have understood that it's not only the interest of society, but their own interest, because otherwise they will, one day or the other, there is no business for them. Therefore, it's a good sign. Not enough, maybe, not all of them, but good. But, the great change is that in Paris, we were able to have everybody. It was an enormous challenge because if there was not everybody, there was no agreement. And that's about diplomacy. We did it. We were supported, obviously, by the international context at the time. I mean, United States presided over by President Obama, China, which has played a very positive role, India, Europe, France, and many others. Everybody said, okay, maybe not everybody was enthusiastic, but they signed, okay. Since that moment, things have been different for many reasons. And I cannot hide the fact that President Trump had an enormous responsibility. Maybe, and it's a paradox, not for within US themselves, because within US, at home, if I may say so, many companies have said, no, we are going our proper way and we don't accept this sort of elements. But abroad, many countries, and you can name them, which were not enthusiastic at all in Paris, but they've signed, well, they said, well, why? If the president of the most powerful power in the world is not in, if he says it's a hoax, why should we make efforts? And Antonio Guterres called them the somnambulists. Okay, that's right. That's a minimum. And unfortunately, they have gained power. Fortunately, since 2 months, things maybe are changing in the good direction, because you had the very important statement of Chinese president, the statement of Japanese new prime minister, the statement and the commitment of South African president, new positions of UK, this agreement a few hours ago in Brussels, and so on and so forth. And obviously you had the election of President Biden, whose proposals are obviously very different from President Trump. Therefore, there is a sort of momentum. We shall see tomorrow with the summit. If really new countries or old countries, several countries are delivering because you're right. The question, and His Royal Highness was right. The question is implementing the Paris Agreement. Now we have a framework. It's not the time to invent a new framework. It would be stupid, but we have to deliver. Therefore, it is a time for action. It is a time for implementation, and it is what is at stake, preparing Glasgow, COP26 next year.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you for that, President Fabius. It really is, well, it's extraordinary what's happened in the past 5 years, as you pointed out. And we are looking ahead now to next year and COP26. And I'm going to move on now to Anne-Marie Trevelyan, who is a UK MP and the former Secretary of State for International Development, and has now a stunning new role as the UK champion for adaptation and resilience, which are subjects which are often overlooked, adaptation and resilience, but very important. And I'd like to ask you, Anne-Marie Trevelyan, we've got the example of French diplomacy and what was achieved at Paris. How is the UK taking this forward, and how are we progressing towards COP26?
Thank you, Fiona. Distinguished panelists, partners, Monsieur le Président, Madame l'Ambassadrice, thank you for having me this evening, and good evening to all of you. I'm really delighted to have the opportunity to speak here today in my new role as the UK's International Adaptation Resilience Champion for COP26, especially on such an important occasion, 5 years today since COP21 and that landmark Paris Agreement. I think, as Monsieur le Président said, reaching that momentous agreement was the result of years of hard work by the international community, and as you say, Fiona, by extraordinary diplomatic effort across the globe from so many. As you know, that tomorrow is the UK COP26 presidency, UN and France hosting together our virtual leader-level ambition summit in partnership with Chile as the COP25 president and Italy as our COP26 partners. The challenge that we have through COP26 is that we must accelerate progress towards implementing those commitments that were made under the Paris goals on mitigation, on finance, and on adaptation. So although, as we've all known, COP26 has been postponed until next year because of COVID, I think we, the UK, are clear that climate action cannot wait. So we need to demonstrate the urgency with which we need to fulfill our Paris Agreement commitments. All of us, every country, the somnambulists, as well as those of us who continue to remain awake and want to drive this forward. I'm really pleased to say that tomorrow, despite the challenges of the pandemic, we expect over 80 world leaders to come together behind climate action with ambitious presentations of what they're going to be doing next. From what I've seen so far, the overriding good news from this summit is that the Paris Agreement is working. It's doing its job to increase those commitments for climate action towards a green and resilient recovery that will keep the goal of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees in sight. Tomorrow is critical to show that on all of the key pillars of the Paris Agreement, we must deliver progress. And tomorrow will therefore highlight that where we are with less than a year to COP26 is so important. We know that a limit of 1.5 degrees isn't enough to prevent people all around the world from experiencing the severe impacts of climate change. According to some figures from the International Federation for the Red Cross, in the last 10 years, an estimated 1.8 billion people have been affected by natural hazards. 97% of those people being affected specifically by extreme weather and climate shock events. And of course, of those, women and girls are always most dramatically affected. This year, we've seen many more examples, prolonged periods of extreme heat across Siberia and the Middle East, hundreds of wildfires burning across the USA and Australia, Cyclone Amphan devastating communities across India and Bangladesh, and recently disastrous flooding in Nicaragua. So through my role as Adaptation Resilience Champion, my priority is going to be working with governments, businesses and civil society to drive forwards that global ambition and action, most importantly, to support the countries most impacted by climate change, to adapt and to build long-term resilience and avert, minimize and address the loss and damage challenges. Because of course, climate change disproportionately impacting those most vulnerable is a key issue as we go forwards. It's critical that I and the presidency listen to and support those most adversely impacted by climate shocks: women and girls, young people, indigenous peoples, people with disabilities, and marginalized groups. We know that 75% of people displaced by natural disasters are women and children. They are more vulnerable to the impacts of climate change as a result of structural inequalities, discrimination, and sociocultural and economic barriers. So the UK is absolutely committed to implementing the Gender Action Plan published at COP25, and we encourage other countries to do the same. We must all prioritise gender-responsive climate action and finance in order to tackle the uneven gender relations which exacerbate the damaging effects of climate change on women and girls. So we will be using the COP26 presidency to encourage greater political ambition, tools, finance, coordination, and those commitments to support practical adaptation and resilience action. This will help to keep all countries, communities, and people safe from the impacts of climate shocks, but particularly those who are most vulnerable. I think COVID-19 has been a powerful reminder of the world's vulnerability to systemic risks, of the major threat that climate change, habitat, and biodiversity loss pose to global prosperity and security, and particularly in those most vulnerable countries. So we must and will seize the opportunity to learn from the pandemic and look to increase our resilience to impacts of climate change, environmental degradation, and those sectors exposed to transition risks. We do not have a choice. We must act now. And that will be the energy and drive for COP26. Thank you. And I'm really looking forward to the rest of this discussion.
Thank you very much indeed for that, and some really important points raised there, which we will return to as well. Thank you. I'm going to move on now to Alan Jope, who is the Chief Executive of Unilever. And one of the innovations in the lead up to COP21 and the Paris Agreement was that the French adopted something that was known as 360-degree diplomacy, which involves not just states talking to one another, but also people from business, people from civil society, and people from local governments, cities, and subnational governments, and so on. Businesses, therefore, played an important role at the Paris Agreement, and they've continued to do so since. So I'd like to ask you, Alan Jope, really, what have businesses done since Paris, and what are you doing towards COP26?
Hi, Fiona, and good evening to fellow panelists and the audience. Well, look, when we spoke, Anne-Marie, ahead of this panel, you regaled me with a story of my predecessor arguing about what ice cream would be served at one of the banquets in Paris. And of course, it's an amusing story, but the ice cream in question, which happened to be Ben & Jerry's, is a reflection of the type of business that we want to be. We want and we believe that business and brands can be a force for good. So there's a, if you pardon the pun, there's a swirl of seriousness in the role that something like Ben & Jerry's can play in all of this. Ben & Jerry's has a long tradition of campaigning on causes, particularly on climate change, but also on things like LGBTQI rights, on racial justice, long before Black Lives Matter. We have a Ben & Jerry's flavor. It's rather awfully called Save Our Swirled. It raises awareness around climate action against the theme line of if it's melted, it's ruined. And if I may just mention, yesterday we announced our Ben & Jerry's Colin Kaepernick flavor, Change the World, which will support social justice. Now, the reason I dig in a bit on all of this is because there's a very dangerous false dichotomy out there, which is that sustainability and economic growth are a choice, when in fact there is no trade-off whatsoever between purpose and profits. We profoundly believe as a business that the low carbon revolution will be good for the environment. It will be good for livelihoods. By the way, I couldn't agree more with Anne-Marie that it will be good for women. It will be good for growth, and brands and companies that lead with that mindset that there is no trade-off will win in the long term. Now, stepping back a few years, it's a privilege, quite frankly, to be on a panel alongside President Fabius. It was a historic moment, and not only for climate change, but it was a measure of our collective ability to respond to a shared global crisis. And it came at a time when I was losing faith in the system to deliver outcomes, where UN summits were just talking shops, unable to resolve these big challenges. And my predecessor, who was closely involved in some of the work around the Paris Agreement, told me, President Fabius, about the prominence that you gave to engaging your top diplomatic teams, that you mobilized the whole of France's foreign network and your missions around the world. And we hope that's the priority that COP26 will receive from the British government. And I'm delighted to see Anne-Marie in her champion role. So here we are in 2020. It's been, frankly, a bit of a ghastly year. We've seen governments and business battling to control this health crisis that's turning into an economic crisis, on top of a social crisis, on top of an environmental crisis. But we're seeing progress. Just 2 weeks ago, the UK committed a big new reduction. China's come to the table. The European Green Deal mentioning a 55% reduction. And we welcome the USA coming back to the table. But please don't put it all on the heads of government. Business too is taking steps. Net zero by 2050, frankly, is becoming table stakes. We've committed to be net zero by 2039. And the talk of building back better, the Great Reset, whatever you want to call it, has to be more than a tagline. The tragedy of this year also presents an opportunity for government and private sector to inject a green stimulus back into the economy. We should not congratulate ourselves at all. We need more commitments. We need more short-term actions to start realizing those commitments. And we need to invest above all in a low carbon economy that creates these much needed jobs. Now, a year from now, COP26 in my hometown, Glasgow, can be a festival of celebration of net zero commitments, a celebration of action plans, and the closing off of some technicalities that have been getting in the way. The hard work is already well underway, and I can tell you, Unilever and most of my colleagues in the private sector certainly plan to try and lead by example, joined at the hip with government. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. And we do look forward to Glasgow. I'm going to move on now to Camille Parmesan, who is professor at the University of Plymouth and the University of Texas, and also a laureate of Make Our Planet Great Again, and who recalls the struggles of that led up to the Paris Agreement and the triumph that was the Paris Agreement as well, having participated in that. And Professor Parmesan, science has moved on as well as politics and business since the Paris Agreement was signed 5 years ago. How has science both made the dangers of climate change more apparent and the solutions, brought the solutions closer?
I think one thing I've noticed very strongly in the last 5 years is scientists themselves, even basic research scientists, are getting involved in the solutions space. And it's really exciting because in academia, you're often, there's a lot of reward for doing high profile basic research papers. And there's not a whole lot of reward for doing what's called more applied science. And what's so brilliant is because climate change has become so pervasive, everyone is seeing it in all of their systems. So it's very difficult now to be a basic researcher and not have to incorporate climate change impacts into what you're doing, regardless of what your question is. So very rapidly, scientists are, whether they want to or not, getting involved in climate change assessment and in trying to develop solutions for climate change impacts. And what's exciting also is that I've been involved in IPCC for 25 years or so. And that whole time, we were told, I was in the impacts working group, and we were told, focus on the observed and future impacts, and don't be policy prescriptive, which we interpreted as don't tell us what to do, don't tell the governments what to do. So fine, we just put the hardcore science in. And now with the 6th assessment report, for the first time, the impacts working group is being told, we'd like to hear about solutions. So it's fabulous. It's opened us up to being able to not be prescriptive, but to assess the range of options of solutions to climate change. And it's turning out that what are called nature-based solutions are going to be really key to reducing greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And I say nature-based, not plant-based, because planting a tree is fine, but planting a forest of lodgepole pines all at the same time, all the same age, is actually not a good climate solution, because you're creating a forest that's very sterile. It doesn't have all the species that a forest should have. And it's actually very vulnerable to climate change. It's vulnerable to pest outbreaks, to the increase in diseases, increase in pest outbreaks, increased fire risk that climate change is already causing, much less where it's going in the future. So what we want is, yes, forests are good for storing carbon, sucking up carbon, but we want healthy, diverse forest, hence nature-based solutions, not just plant-based solutions. And if, bear with me, and I'm going to share my screen just for a moment, because what I want to point out is that in ecology, there's the science of ecological restoration has also blossomed in the last 25, 30 years. So we can restore habitats, many, many habitats that 30 years ago, no one would have thought of restoring. This is in Southern California. It was just a trashed field used for recreation by off-road vehicles. And just 3 years later, it's now a thriving habitat for what are called vernal pools, seasonal winter pools. These are very special habitats. It's now habitat for 5 endangered species. It's self-sustaining. It will go on like this. We don't have to keep putting work into it. Now, this system is not particularly a high carbon system, but I could say the same thing about many other systems that actually do suck up and store very large amounts of carbon. So nature-based solutions are allowing us to go from purely conservation adaptation into mitigation. And everyone always thinks of tropical rainforest. Yes, tropical rainforests are great. They hold a lot of carbon. But did you know that seagrass, native seagrasses, Mediterranean seagrass, holds almost twice as much carbon? And peatlands, which the UK has an abundant supply of, hold 7 to 10 times more carbon than other systems. So we're in the position now where the scientists, not only are scientists being interested in developing solutions and working with more applied groups, working with industry to develop solutions, governments are now realizing that they need a whole range of solutions, that there's not a single silver bullet, and that nature-based solutions are a huge part of this. And we, fortunately, the science of restoration is to the point where we can actually do this. This is not just a pie in the sky idea. We can really do this. We can restore degraded systems throughout the world, not every single system, but quite a lot of them. And I just want to end by agreeing with what Prince Charles said. And now I feel when I talk to the public, when I talk to policymakers, increasingly people understand we are one planet, we are one people. And that's been a very exciting change over the last 5 years.
Thank you very much. That was inspiring, actually. It was lovely to see those good news stories from nature-based solutions to climate change. Thank you very much for that. I'm going to open up to our panelists now to ask you collectively about some of the issues that we're facing as a result of the pandemic, because we've touched on this. You've all mentioned, you know, the fact that we are in an unprecedented year because of the pandemic, but we are grappling with this COVID-19 problem at the same time as we are trying to solve the biodiversity crisis and the climate crisis, and, you know, the economic problems that are besetting us all because of COVID-19. I'd like to ask about how governments are coping with what has been called the green recovery from COVID-19. Prince Charles mentioned this. He called it the Great Reset, where we try to reset the world economy onto a low carbon path. President Fabius, I'd like to come to you first and see, do you think that we as a world are using this opportunity that you mentioned of the pandemic to reset ourselves on a green path?
Not enough, not enough. It's what I call the great paradox. What do I mean? On the one hand, you have coronavirus, which is a catastrophe. And governments are taking decisions, which are dramatic decisions, but it's I mean, in the way things must go, because the pandemic is so heavy that the governments and the different actors have to react. Okay. But, and it's where the paradox lies. When you are thinking about climate warming, I would say that it is much more detrimental, much more terrific, much more negative than COVID itself, even in terms of health and dead people. And the paradox is that up to now, I want to be honest, many governments have not taken the same level of decisions as for COVID. Why? My own explanation is that we have not insisted enough on the health consequences of climate warming. And the shadow of death, I don't want to utilize fear, but, you know, many people are thinking that climate warming, the consequences will take place within 50 years, but it's not true, it's now. I remember a chat I had with Michael Bloomberg during Paris, and he said to me, well, Mr. Fabius, be careful. There are two mistakes to avoid. The first one is to give the people the impression that it is within 50 years. Well, in 50 years, many of us will be old. And no, it's not, it's for now. And the second mistake to avoid, it's to be only negative. No, you have to be positive as well, and to explain that there are solutions, that it can be, well, we didn't choose it, but it can be an opportunity to change. In practical terms, it means that the recovery plans, which are today designed to fight against the consequences of coronavirus, must be green at the same time. And honestly, when I'm looking at them, I'm not sure that it is the case of every single recovery plan. Now, I would like to add one comment. When I was listening to the CEO of Unilever, I say hello to him. He said, and he's quite right, now the perspective is the carbon neutrality. That's very true. It's a new concept. And in the recent weeks, I'm struck by the fact that a new concept, a new horizon is taking place. I would say 3 horizons. The longest one, the most far away, is carbon neutrality. And as far as states are concerned, it's 2050, maybe 2060. Okay, carbon neutrality. But for the middle term horizon, it's 2030, and it's all the decisions which must be taken in the framework of our nationally determined contribution, and a short-term horizon, which are recovery plans. And you know, it's very positive, because if you have a long-term horizon, a middle-term horizon, a short-term horizon, and if it is true, both for governments, both for companies, both for local authorities, you are going in the right direction. And it will be one of the tasks of Glasgow COP to implement that in order to evaluate these different horizons and to make it, you know, more coherent. And I think this way of thinking about how to fight against climate change, it's brand new.
Thank you very much. That's really important, actually, to align the short term and the medium term with the long-term goals of the Paris Agreement. And it is worrying that you think we're not doing enough. Anne-Marie Trevelyan, do you think that we're not doing enough to align our short-term goals with the recovery from COVID with those medium and long-term goals?
I think...
Sorry, please. Sorry.
No, still, thank you. I think Laurent sets out really well, actually, that challenge of seeing the horizons ahead of us. And I think the challenge of using COVID to reset is the challenge for me all the way through this year has been the question of our preparedness, you know, in every country across the world, and in understanding whether we were indeed prepared for what has been on certainly on every Western nation's risk register for many years, the threat of a pandemic. Were we actually prepared, and did we understand genuinely, had we thought through, was it possible to think through what the impacts could and would be should such a thing happen to us? And I think it's understanding within the climate change space and the challenge of whether we are prepared, and I think Laurent's 3 horizons are really helpful for that. Just how prepared must we be for the climate shocks to come? Meeting the neutrality challenge is a mission, it is a direction of travel. Paris has set the framework for countries to move into that. But the reality of being prepared to achieve that is one that I think we shouldn't underestimate, but we should absolutely take this year's challenge to know what it feels like when nobody was prepared enough to cope with the ripples and the impacts across every part of our daily lives and every business and every trading environment, and in changing one set of normal metrics, the way we lived our lives, by shutting down human contacts. We created a ripple effect of what will be financial proportions, which we are all paying for many years to come. So I think the challenge that we have, and the challenge that we will take for COP26, is to drive that through at every level, so that not only in our NDCs, in the adaptation communications that countries think forward, we really understand that being prepared is much more than the NDC on paper. It is exactly that midterm horizon that Laurent talks about, which is the governance frameworks, the structures. You know, the UK put its Climate Change Act into law in 2008. So that's 12 years ago now. And we have been building layer upon layer of it, filtering out to business, to councils, to civil society. But actually that takes time, it takes a lot of technical effort. And I think we have to drive through and support those vulnerable countries who need more support to be able to build those frameworks, because preparedness is now, and 2030, whilst it's 10 years off now, by then those have to be embedded and part of everybody's structure, because the climate shocks are coming now, they're going to keep coming, they're going to get stronger, more unpredictable, and that preparedness, which allows resilience to be built in every part of the world, different everywhere, and that's the challenge, where adaptation to ensure resilience is a slightly, it's just like a smorgasbord of choices, so it's much more difficult to find the mechanisms to help everybody to really see what those are. But the key for me is that we ensure we are genuinely prepared, we understand that the threat is now, and to be ahead of that threat and to support those we want to protect and the livelihoods we want to sustain, we must get that right next year.
Thank you very much. And I'd like to ask Alan Jope whether he thinks that businesses are actually putting themselves on a path to a green recovery from this pandemic and economic crisis.
Well, there are headwinds and there are tailwinds. And some of the headwinds that are preventing business from taking the correct action are things like cheap fossil fuels. That doesn't help. Things like ridiculous retreat to nationalism, denying the interconnected nature of the world. Surely the pandemic has shown us that. Things like the mindset that I identified earlier, that people see it as a trade-off between sustainable business and good financial outcomes. It's a ridiculous notion, but it's the dominant notion. But fortunately, there are equally powerful, maybe more powerful tailwinds that are driving change. The tailwind of young people. Young people have been let down by the grown-ups, that's us, and they're not going to take it anymore. And we see the power of the market starting to take hold. The consumer choices that are being made now are moving sharply in a more sustainable direction. Baby boomers, at least, are honest. They don't pretend that they make their brand choices based on sustainability considerations. Gen X, which I just creep into, we're worse. We lie. We say that we care about sustainability, but still go buy our gas guzzlers. Then the millennials, it certainly does affect the behavior and choices of millennials. But not when it's too inconvenient or too expensive. But the Gen Zennials, the true young future consumers, sustainability and the conduct of the companies and brands that they're choosing or not choosing is about the only thing driving their choice. So any company, any business that wants to remain relevant into the future needs to be taking action now to position its portfolio and its business practices on more sustainable, more purposeful platforms. That's what we're trying to do. And the first step is to accept that that is a better business outcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that outlook there. We'll see if that is shared by other businesses, not necessarily, I fear. I'd like to remind the audience, actually, that you can ask questions at any point, and we will be able to relay them to our panelists. We've got some questions coming in now, so I'm going to start putting them to our panelists now, and I'd like to come to you first, Professor Parmesan, because we've got a question on the news this week. I'm sure you've seen it, that the mass of human-made stuff in the world, things that we have produced, whether it's plastic waste in the oceans or buildings around us, whatever humans have done, now surpasses the Earth's entire global biomass. And that's not just because we have made so much stuff, but also because we have destroyed so much biomass, deforested such large areas, killed off so many creatures. Professor, how do you react to that? Is that bad news?
Yes, I would say that's really bad news. And can I say it is hard to stay an optimist in my field, but part of that number is because these synthetic materials don't break down in the environment. And so can I be the eternal optimist and say that, again, one of the exciting new things that's happening in science is we are devising ways of breaking down these materials, of creating synthetic materials that will degrade. So I am hoping, again, the problem, and Alan Jupe can talk to this, is that it becomes more expensive to produce synthetic materials that will degrade and produce the various organisms to be able to degrade them. Becomes a more expensive world to live in. But at least if the science is starting to get there, at least that will be an option which we hope governments will take up. And I do see, when I talk to the public, increasing worry about this. There is an understanding that is resonating with the public, that we're putting all these plastics out that just stay around and float around the world over and over and over again, and never even though they get to a point where you can't see them, they're still causing environmental damage. And so I think that gives me a ray of hope, that if I'm giving a talk to the public about another topic, they ask me about plastics, and I tell them, well, we're starting to be able to see how to deal with this. We have a long way to go, but at least we're starting to be able to see how to deal with this. And so again, it's like, I think one thing that COVID has taught us is if we have a collective consciousness that something specific needs to be done globally, we are able to do it. I mean, it's incredible. We have several vaccines that are working less than a year after the pandemic started. So we just have to have the will.
Thank you very much. Yes, so the pandemic has some great lessons for what we can do if we try as well. That's really important. I've got some questions here which I'm going to put together slightly from a few questioners. They would like to know that, well, we've got these countries coming together for Paris and coming together tomorrow at the Climate Ambition Summit. We've got, I think Anne-Marie Trevelyan mentioned, was it 80 plus countries now, which is a lot. But that's not everyone. And there are some countries that, although they participated in Paris, have since then not shown great willingness to come forward with the kind of medium-term targets that President Fabius mentioned, or indeed the long-term targets that we also need. And there are countries that appear to be going backwards, have gone backwards since the Paris Agreement. So the question is how to bring those recalcitrant countries back into the fold. President Fabius, how would you do it? You brought these countries together at Paris. How would you bring them back now, the countries that seem more reluctant?
I was kindly questioned by the British government about this particular point, and more generally, they were kind enough to ask me, well, Paris is considered as being a success, therefore what is the key? My answer was, I'm not sure, and anyway, every COP is different, therefore I cannot say there is a secret. But my answer was 3 words: work, trust, and ambition. Work, because it's very clear that it is not possible to solve the very difficult question you have to solve during the COP itself in 15 days. No. Therefore, there is a preparatory work which is both very interesting and terrible. You must have a direct contact, face-to-face, with the leaders in every country. It's not good for gas emission, I must confess, but it's the only way to know what is at stake and how to convince, and in particular, those recalcitrants or somnambulists or whatever. Therefore, work, preparatory work. Second, trust. What does it mean? The country which is welcoming the COP is welcoming the COP in the name of the whole world. It's not his own ideas that he has to impose to people. And in particular, at the final stage, you can try and negotiate and match a compromise only if people are thinking that the compromise that you are proposing to them is the best one, and that it doesn't get out of your pocket secretly, but that it has been built by everybody and that everybody has been listened to, even the smallest. And it was the case in Paris. And, you know, we had 3 different texts, and we had what we called Indaba. It was coined in South Africa. It is during the night. And every night we spend hours to listen to everybody, not to fool them, but to know what is the point, where is the compromise? And third, ambition, because it's possible to get a deal if it is a minimum deal, but we don't need a minimum deal. We need a maximum deal. And therefore, one of the most tricky points, let's speak bluntly, is that we had an international context in 2015, which is not the same today, even though we had recently some better news. Basically, we need to have the agreement of China, which is the first emitter, more than EU plus the Americans. You had to have the agreement of US, and the relationship between the two are not so good. Therefore, you have to have a special climate for climate. You have to have the agreement of Europe, I mean Europe, of every European country. You have to have India, and you have to exert a pressure on the most difficult ones, name them. It's possible if it is a sort of mixture between very practical pressures, and there are tools, and the pressure of the people. You have named young people, you've named the public opinion, the companies, you know, everybody must go in the same direction. I'm not sure it can work, but it's the only way to get a real deal. Now, I would like to answer, because I don't want to speak too much, a question which has not been raised, but which is a real one. You know, all of us, we think that Paris has been a success and that we need to go forward. But I'm sure that if you ask general public, Paris, was it a real success? People will not answer that way. They would say, okay, it was good, there was a gavel, everybody was happy. But today, we have catastrophes. We have droughts, we have tempests, we have fires, and therefore, what is the use of that? We must answer that one. We must answer that one. And the answer is, like always, rather complex, which is a pity. Before Paris, the trend, the general trend, was between 5 degrees and 6 degrees. Now, it's around 3 degrees, a bit more than 3 degrees. But it's not enough. And it's the reason why you must implement more quickly, more deeply Paris, because we must go to 2 degrees or 1.5. It has been already a success, but it's not enough. And maybe if we explain that, people will be less reluctant about the agreements, because, you know, people everywhere are reluctant towards great elements about politicians and so on and so forth. We have to convince them to demonstrate that there have been changes, but today it's not enough.
Thank you. That's very important to bring the general public with us. I'd like to ask Anne-Marie Trevelyan how the UK proposes to bring some of these countries on board. We've got the Climate Ambition Summit tomorrow. I interviewed the UN Secretary General this week, and he named several countries to me as needing to come forward with plans. We had Brazil, India, Indonesia, Russia, Australia. Have you got plans for any of these countries to bring them together?
So I think the key issue, I think, for all of us, and obviously with the UK leadership, is to demonstrate that we are walking the walk. I think without that, it's always much harder to bring others with you. So first, to mention the UK's domestic leadership on emissions reductions, that first part, we announced our ambitious NDC last Friday, committing to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by 68% by 2030. And that's the fastest rate of emissions reductions commitment of any major economy. It's a really decisive step forward in our ambition to tackle that 10-year window ahead of us as we accelerate towards that binding net zero by 2050 commitment. And it builds on that strong domestic success of decarbonising our economy. But that's only one part of it. And I think the really important part, which Laurent was just really alluding to there, is to highlight progress on adaptation and resilience. And so we'll be publishing tomorrow at the Ambition Summit the UK's first adaptation communication, which will be submitted alongside our mitigation and support commitments. So therefore bringing together those three critical pillars of the Paris Agreement. Because as Laurent says, the Paris Agreement was an extraordinary moment of crystallizing agreement on how to do it, but actually delivering on each of those three, the mitigation, the adaptation and the finance, is how we will deliver that action and that change. So domestically, our scientific capability in the UK climate projections, as well as our flood risk management, are improving our preparedness to climate risks. But of course, there's a need to go further to implement that activity. So we need to enhance resilience of people, of environment, of infrastructure, and of the economy. And this will be achieved by working and learning from others. I think that's a really important part of how the COP family can make progress, overcoming those gaps and barriers, working out how to have effective monitoring of adaptation action. So through COP26 internationally, our priorities are going to be really driving that tangible action on the ground, showcasing examples of successful programs and projects, and protecting people from the impacts of those climate shocks, those extreme weather events, through enhanced disaster response and preparedness, and increasing both the availability and the efficiency of adaptation resilience finance. I think one of the frustrations for me too often is that there's money spent on disaster response, which if we were prepared, as I was mentioning earlier, we brought that forward and invested it in disaster preparedness, the cost of the response wouldn't be required. So it's changing how we think about financing that will be so important. And so the UK is already supporting some key programs on that: the Risk Informed Early Action Partnership, the Coalition for Climate Resilient Investment, and the LDC-led Initiative for Effective Adaptation and Resilience. So as COP president, we really want to work with all parties in the run-up to COP26 to come forward with those ambitious adaptation plans, and for those who have, to work on implementing them. So that'll be the critical enablers to really support driving that across. The ambition, of course, one of those three pillars of Laurent's keys to success is ambition. And it's the only way we're going to meet the challenge of climate change through real, on-the-ground, ambitious action. So that'll be the absolutely central part of the COP26 efforts.
Okay, thank you very much. And you've brought up this very important question of adaptation and resilience there, adapting to the impacts of climate change, helping people become more resilient. I'd like to ask Professor Parmesan, actually, you brought up nature-based solutions earlier. Obviously, things like growing trees is a nature-based solution to climate change, as trees act as a carbon sink. But can nature-based solutions also help us with adapting to the impacts of climate change?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, think of the most obvious one is coastal systems. If you think of sea level rise is something that we actually have a better handle on than many of the more specific climate trends in many regions, the sea will continue to rise. And it's very clear from various hurricanes and other extreme events that when you have a sound coastal system, you know, you've got good wetland areas and healthy mangrove systems and coral reefs along the coast, that those storms don't cause anything like the damage to the urban area that's along that coast than they do in areas where that coast has been degraded. So it's very, very clear that increasing the natural buffering capacity of these coastal systems, which you do by restoring the mangroves, restoring the coral reefs, restoring the coastal wetlands, is the cost of doing that is nothing compared to the cost you save in saving the damages to the urban area that's next to the coast. And in the UK, you've got a lot of problems with increased flooding and a lot of problems with increased storm surge. So the ability of natural systems to buffer the communities against those extreme events is, I would say, well proven at this point. So absolutely it helps with adaptation. And we are doing a lot with urban adaptation. And I don't call these necessarily nature-based solutions, because in urban areas, you know, sort of planting green space often is not, you know, doing an enormous amount for biodiversity, but it can do a lot to help these urban areas stay a little bit cooler. So planting, having green roofs, planting green parks will help people to cope with heat waves, help people to cope with and again, with flood events in urban areas. The more sort of natural sponges you've had, I think people even call these sponge cities, where you've got various green areas that are created specifically to soak up heavy rains, to be able to deal with that, are, I think, going to be key to helping humans adapt. So when I say nature-based solutions, I'm not just talking about helping wild species adapt. I'm talking about helping humans adapt to climate change as well.
Thank you very much for that. I love the idea of these urban sponges. I'd like to also ask about business at this point, because Alan, Joe, we've got people are questioning the fact that a lot of companies make money out of the situation as it is, the high carbon economy that we have at the moment, from oil and gas, for instance, and so on. So a lot of companies are actually going to have to not just change their ways, but some companies might actually have to go out of business altogether. There are lots of areas of economic activity that will just have to stop while we change to a low carbon economy and you know, start to rely on low carbon energy sources and so on. How do you do that? How do you tell some people that they've got to go out of business?
Well, look, capitalism has done, in my opinion, a lot of good in the world. It's a relatively efficient way of allocating resources. It's lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. It's been a spur to innovation and creativity, and it's engendered a lot of healthy competition. But there's a couple of problems with capitalism. It treats natural resources as if they're infinite, and it's blindingly obvious we need to put a price on carbon. And secondly, capitalism is creating tremendous social injustice. So we believe there is an emerging model of capitalism 2.0. We will shift away from this stakeholder-only model to a shareholder-only model to a multi-stakeholder model that puts people, the planet, and the environment at the center of businesses. Maybe most importantly, it will be a model that is circular, does not treat resources as if they're infinite. The question that Camille answered about the enormous amount of man-made mass can only be resolved if we have a model of consumption that recovers as much from the environment as we put into the environment, so-called circular model. But finally, we need to introduce different metrics. So at the moment, businesses are judged, frankly, only on top line, bottom line, and cash flow, and that is ridiculous. We need to have a suite of metrics by which businesses are held accountable for their environmental impact and their social impact, as well as their financial impact. And when that happens, Darwinian influences will take effect and businesses will go out of business. Private sector is used to companies going out of business. So it's going to be reinvent or die for most companies. And that's the path that we think we're on. And it will involve putting a price on carbon and a just transition, which is why I mentioned earlier the importance of creating jobs at the same time as we tackle the environmental crisis. People are not going to consume responsibly if they're struggling to put food on the table. So a jobs-led recovery, a green recovery, they go hand in hand.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that note of optimism there. I'm also, I've got some questions coming in asking about civil society and what people can do. President Fabius, you mentioned that that people are really key here, that you know, as a constituency, people perhaps haven't fully appreciated the impact of the Paris Agreement yet, because they're still seeing a lot of the negative impacts of climate change. How do we ensure that we have broad support around the world from ordinary people for climate action going forward to COP26?
It's not an easy one, and obviously it has not the same effect. Well, around the world, general public, whether you are in a democracy or in a not democracy, they have a soul, they have a psychology, they have an opinion. But in democracy, it counts. In other countries, it doesn't count so much. Okay. But I think Alan has touched and Maya has touched two main points. The first one is just transition, just transition. It is included in the Paris Agreement, but at that time we were not, maybe not enough. We didn't pay so much attention to this element, which is central, because if you take good decision in order to encourage low carbon society, but if it is too costly for people, and especially for ordinary people, they will say no. They will say no. And there are some examples. You remember the question of Gilets jaunes in France, which was a real problem because the government at that time decided to raise a tax on oil and so on. It made sense. And I will come to the carbon pricing in a minute. But people who were in the countryside, who had only one way of being transported, their own car. And if they have the feeling that it will cost them and have low salaries, an enormous amount of money, they say no. They say no. It is the same to a certain extent in Germany, in a different context. You know that Germany has decided that in 2038, there will be no coal industry. Okay, but they have put 40 billion euros in the regions which are directly impacted for training the population, for giving grants and so on and so forth. Therefore, the idea that fighting against climate change, it's also fighting against inequalities, and that there has to be, the steps must be accompanied socially, is a key question. Now, the question of carbon pricing. Personally, I think, and we shall surely agree between us, that carbon pricing is a decisive element. Why? Because we are in a market economy, and if you want to get this result, that people get out carbon and that they go to the new energy, you have to pay a price for carbon. And today it's exactly the other way around. And these industries and these sectors, I mean, coal, oil, and so on and so forth, they are subsidized on our money. Therefore, obviously, we have to give a price to carbon. And it's beginning in Europe, US, China, and so on and so forth. Not maybe at a level great enough, but it's starting. But the point is that from an economic viewpoint, if there is a carbon pricing, price for carbon, but if some other countries have not the same system, the economic theory tells us that you have to put a border carbon tax in order to have a leveling playing field. Okay, that's about theory, is that good? But China says no. But developing countries say no, because they say, okay, that's a figment of your imagination that you have put on the table in order to prevent us from having a safe competition with us. And this question of carbon pricing and of border carbon tax will be one of the most touchy questions next year and the years after. And it's not that easy to solve, I must admit. Therefore, we must help everybody to go in that direction. By the way, Anne-Marie, you have explained perfectly well what were the assets you had. There is another asset. You will chair the G7 next year. Mm-hmm. And our fellow Italians will chair the G20. It doesn't mean that you will be able to convince everybody, but these are tools and they will be used, I'm sure.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that message. And on that note, actually, we've got, we're going to wrap up now, but it's the Climate Ambition Summit tomorrow, which is where world leaders will be meeting, as we've mentioned. I'm going to give each of you 20 seconds each to tell me what you would say, one message for world leaders meeting tomorrow in very few words. Professor Parmesan, what's the one message you'd give?
Treat climate change like ongoing COVID.
Thank you very much. Alan Job, what's your one message for world leaders meeting tomorrow?
Make a commitment and build a plan to get there.
Thank you very much indeed. Anne-Marie Trevelyan, well, the UK is co-hosting the meeting tomorrow, so you've got a message?
The message there, my message personally would be believe that it's possible and know that we do this for all those who we are responsible for, and it is possible to achieve ambition and success.
Thank you very much indeed. And President Fabius, you are actually addressing the meeting tomorrow, I believe. So perhaps you could just very briefly encapsulate the main message that you'll be giving.
You know, I would be very careful, but very straight to the point. Deliver.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you very much to all of our panelists. Thank you for an excellent discussion, and that's really, it's recapped really the importance of the Paris Agreement and what was achieved at Paris, and has also helped us to look ahead to what's going to happen in the next year for COP26, which will be how to fulfill the Paris Agreement. I'd like to just, as well as thanking our panelists, I'd also like to introduce João Vale de Almeida, who's the ambassador and head of delegation for the European Union to the United Kingdom. He's just going to give us a few closing remarks. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Good evening to all of you. I'm happy and honored to be able to close such an interesting event on the eve of another very interesting and very important event. Let me start by thanking my good friend Catherine Colonna, Ambassador of France, our hostess tonight. Merci, Catherine. Thank all the panelists. I learned a lot listening to you. A special word to His Royal Highness, the Prince of Wales. Wise words and well-known commitment to this honorable cause. Un mot particulier à l'égard du président Fabius. Vous avez eu un rôle, je dirais, historique et nous vous en remercions tous et nous sommes sûrs que vous continuerez de partager notre enthousiasme à l'égard de cette lutte contre le changement climatique. I'm particularly happy today, if I may, because I'm saying these few words and listening to you only a few hours after a very important decision taken by the European Union. Our leaders spent the whole night, I must say, until 8:20 in the morning, if I'm not wrong, but they delivered. And they delivered two important decisions, if I'm putting them together. One, of course, a new goal of at least 55% reduction of greenhouse gases by 2030 on the road to climate neutrality by 2050. But they accompanied this with a very important decision regarding the financial needs, the budgetary envelope, the package that will help countries, business, citizens to achieve those goals. We have come a long way, and I realized in thinking about this event that December is really a climate month. Kyoto 23 years ago, Paris 5 years ago, and if I may say at European level, the European Green Deal just a year ago. So a number of anniversaries falling on December, but they show how far we've come. Kyoto, the EU, who had then 15 member states, committed to a reduction of 8%. We are now at 55%, and of course, the magnitude of the Union is completely different. We come a long way, and I was an early climate negotiator more than 10 years ago, and I can remember the situation was very different. And the European Union at the time felt very lonely. It's no longer the case today, and we are very happy for that. About the 55% target, I think, first of all, if I may, it confirms the leadership of the European Union, but it's also a tribute to what you've done, President Fabius, in Paris. It's delivering on Paris. It's enhancing Paris. It's moving the cursor further down the road, and I think that's terribly important. I think it will be a good inspiration for tomorrow's meeting and for COP26. And I wish the best of luck to Anne-Marie Trevelyan and the British government. I'm working together with my EU member states ambassadors in London, together with your teams, and we are all making all the efforts to make Glasgow a great success. Italy, as a co-host, is of course also helping delivering on that. But my other point is to stress that this is not only about government. And we heard in the panel the representatives of business and civil society. But if I take business, this target is an indication, is an element of predictability for the business efforts. It will lower the costs of low carbon technologies. And this is an important indication, an important pointer for the business world to pursue on that track. We need, and the panel addressed this, innovative means of financing for this effort. And I think here, I'm very glad to see how much the United Kingdom is doing, but I'm also proud of what the European Union is doing on green finance, on taxonomy of green activities, on green bond standards, on the International Sustainable Finance Platform. There's a lot going on. There was almost nothing a few years ago. Let's recognize that. The industry and the financial world was very, very far from these themes. They are now fully integrated in that. The other aspect is, of course, that growth and savings need to benefit everyone. The issue of equality that President Fabius raised, the issue of just transition, this is central to the debate. And I can tell you that the discussion our leaders had overnight was also about this. We found the right balance, but there's always these needs to find the balance that bring everybody together. We need a comprehensive set of policies. We call it here a European Green Deal, accompanied by a financial means, as we call it, the next generation EU, the multi-financial framework. So a comprehensive, holistic approach. But we cannot do it alone. The weight of Europe in the global emissions is not too relevant, but I think we can play a role of initiator, of inspiration, leader to this. And we certainly want to do it together with other partners. Paris has shown that only together can we make it. Good news recently, you mentioned it in the panel. I believe there's somehow an alignment of stars on climate action, and this is great news for the world, great news for us as well. I want to salute the British government and their the targets, the new targets that they've set. I followed this in London very attentively, and I think this is an area in which we can cooperate in 21 and beyond, regardless of the framework of our overall cooperation, which is an issue that we will not discuss tonight. But this is clearly a domain in which it only makes sense for the EU and UK to cooperate. But I also note what Japan, South Korea, South Africa, China, and Canada are doing, and this is always welcome. I haven't mentioned the US, but I want to mention the US. I was a former ambassador there, so I mentioned anniversaries. Well, there is another anniversary, I guess today, which is the birthday of John Kerry, and it happens to be our new interlocutor on the American side. So I want to salute John Kerry. I worked with him and his team in the Senate and in the State Department. I think we are all happy to see America back, or the announcement that America, the United States, will be back to Paris, and certainly back in this fight. And of course, we congratulate John Kerry for his birthday, but also for looking forward to cooperation with the United States. So we believe there is a global momentum. You can count on the European Union. I'm sure we can count on the UK. We can count on France, certainly following the success in Paris. And I mean, we are running against time. We are running against climate change. But contrary to other races, this is one where, at the end, everybody wins. Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup. Et à la prochaine.
Ambassador, thank you very much for presenting and explaining the package pledged by the EU. Your speech has completed the picture perfectly, and it stated once more, actually, that it's not just the involvement of all our countries, but also of all our industries, which will turn the tide. We are now going to have a screening of the film tomorrow. All speakers tonight mentioned the need for ambition and some degree of optimism. You also all referred to 360 action. And actually the film does exactly that. It is optimistic. It follows these individuals, communities and businesses who put in place micro-actions to change the situation in their communities. You can watch it after a very brief intermission, sorry. In 10 minutes, the link we sent you will be activated. So you will find the link and the password in the chat box. We've also sent it to you earlier today. So do enjoy the film. You should know as well that you can take a longer break, actually, and watch it at 9 p.m. The link will still be active. Thank you very much for joining us tonight, and enjoy the film.